this lecture, you will learn about the French and Indian War and how that war changed Britain's policies towards its American colonies. At the end of this lecture, you need to be able to describe the causes and course of the French and Indian War and explain how the effects of that war led to changes in British policies. Many historians feel that the end of this conflict is really the start of United States history. In these next couple lectures, we will see how the end of this conflict starts the chain of events that leads to American independence. So what is the French and Indian War? The first conclusion many students draw when they hear the name is that the French were fighting the Native Americans, which seems a little weird because we already learned that they had pretty good relations. The name is actually the one the American colonists used for the conflict. We are not going to refer to the British colonists in North America as British anymore. By the time this war occurs in the mid-1700s, many generations of colonists have been living in North America for nearly 150 years. By this time, a more distinct American culture has developed. But back to the name of the war. The colonists, along with the British, were fighting the French and the Indians, so the war became known as the French and Indian War. The British did have some Native American allies like the Iroquois Indians, but they did not play a major role in the conflict. They kind of sat it out. The war in North America lasted from 1754 to 1763. It is actually just one theater of a much larger worldwide conflict fought between many European nations that was known as the 7 Years' War. Our focus in this class is only on the events occurring in North America. We saw a few weeks ago that the British colonies were confined to a strip of very valuable land along the coast of North America, and that land was surrounded by French claims that were not heavily settled. The population of the British colonies was growing fast, and their hunger for land was insatiable. They wanted to spread west, and the French and Native Americans were in their way. The French saw the writing on the wall and began to fortify the frontier by building forts at strategic points all along the border. They also worked to strengthen relations with their native allies, who they rightly recognized would be essential in a violent conflict. This war starts in western Pennsylvania, when the man who would become our first president, George Washington, is sent by the Virginia militia to build a fort at the intersection of the rivers at the location of what today is modern-day Pittsburgh. When he arrives, he finds the French have already built a fort at the location. He tries to bluff them into surrendering, fails at that, and is later captured after a brief battle. So starts the war, and things just escalate from there. In the first half of this conflict, the French and Indians are giving a total beatdown to the British and Americans. The results of these battles are almost embarrassing. The natives employ all kinds of tactics that the British find dishonorable. Maybe because these tactics were so simple and effective. Natives employed things like surprise, ambushes, camouflage, and, wait for it, shooting from behind trees to clobber the British and Americans. Any European gentleman of the time knew that the only civilized way to fight was to have your soldiers stand in long lines and shoot at each other across an empty field. Those natives were so uncivilized. The new British Prime Minister takes charge of the government and makes lots of changes to the British strategy to turn the war around. First, he greatly increases military spending to secure more troops and weapons. He does this by borrowing boatloads of money. Second, he sends about 20,000 more troops and better commanders to North America. Third, he uses the British Navy, the largest in the world at the time at almost 800 ships, to blockade Canada and prevent French supplies and reinforcements from arriving in North America. These together turn the tide of the war in the British's favor. After a series of battles, the French finally surrender at the Battle of Quebec, which was the capital of New France. Both sides agree to peace with the Peace Treaty of Paris of 1763, which ends the war. So much for New France. Perhaps if they had my 8th graders managing their colony for them, they might have succeeded, but we will never know. Like all war, it's the effects and consequences of the war that make it really important. This war is very important because it leads to an irrevocable change in the relationship between the British government and their American colonies. Britain effectively ends their policy of salutary neglect, which entailed them leaving their colonies to oversee their own development, government, and economies. Now Britain begins to exercise more control over the colonial governments and trade. What's more, the colonists emerged from the war much more confident in their ability to defend themselves. So let's take a look at the most important effects of that war. We learned that New France stretched all across North America. France gives all of its claims in the West between the 13 colonies and the Mississippi River to the British. This leads to lots of excited American colonists. As far as they were concerned, the road west was open, and all they needed to do was steamroll the natives already living there, and they'd have access to all of that land. Then the British King George III says, "Not so fast, Mr. Land-hungry American colonists." You see, the French were defeated, but the British were still very worried about the natives, who had never surrendered. The British could not afford to continue an expensive war with the natives. The king felt that the best way to keep the peace was to keep the American settlers away from the Indians. He issues the Royal Proclamation of 1763. A proclamation is an official statement of policy, kind of like an executive order issued by our president today. It stated that no American settlers could move past the line of the Appalachian Mountains, this line right along here, and move west into this area. Any settlers or soldiers that already owned land in this Indian reserve had to give up their claims. This was a really big problem. First of all, many Americans were already living in this area because it was so thinly populated by the French. Second, in order to enlist many Americans, like George Washington, for example, in the conflict, the British government offered huge tracts of land in this territory as a signing bonus for enlistment. Now they were saying those soldiers couldn't have the land. The Americans were understandably peeved. We learned that this war put Britain in debt. Huge, epic-sized debt, in fact. They needed to pay for the cost of the war, and they wanted the Americans to contribute to this. In the British mind, the war had been fought to protect the Americans from those sinister French. It was only right that the Americans should pay their fair share. This is going to lead to the creation of lots of new taxes. Now, don't think that the 13 colonies never had taxes. They did, but those taxes were levied by the colonial governments, many of which were run by representatives elected by the colonists. Free, wealthy, white male colonists, at least. What was new was that their tax money was now going overseas to Britain. In addition, the British were going to need to start hiring lots of people to enforce their new policies. If you want to collect taxes, you need inspectors and customs officials. If you want to keep the colonists out of the Indian Territory, you need soldiers to guard the border. Finally, the British decided to exercise their right to restrict and control American trade, mainly to the benefit of Britain. This would serve to funnel money and cheap goods into the British economy in a little good old-fashioned mercantilism. Soon we see new British laws designed to aid in their enforcement of policy and collection of taxes. The Americans would come to view these laws as a great violation of their liberty. One was the Quartering Act. This allowed the British to place troops in towns and enforce laws. The colonists were forced to house and feed the troops. The second were writs of assistance. These were given to tax collectors and gave them the legal authority to search and seize goods to enforce the taxes. An unforeseen consequence of this conflict was that Americans got a little more confident in their ability to defend themselves. They had fought in the war, and in many cases had fought well. Many of the colonies were defended not by British troops, but by militias. These were local men required to train and equip themselves to protect their community. Our modern-day version of this is the National Guard. The colonists had gained real combat experience in the war. They had a little swagger to their step. They also learned some very useful tactics from the Native Americans. Some colonial leaders appeared, men like George Washington, who felt angered by the British actions and confident in his ability to lead men in battle. Also Ben Franklin, who at the start of the conflict in 1754 proposed the Albany Plan of Union. This would have united the individual colonies under national leadership. This national government could have raised money and fielded an army to fight the French and take their land. The plan did not go anywhere, however, because the individual colonies were not willing to give up their authority. They needed a much bigger threat to bring them together. Dun, dun, dun. That was my lame attempt at foreshadowing. Go watch the next video.